Story 1. I used to work as a funeral director. I'd been in the field for years, so I was no stranger to the quiet, unsettling atmosphere that clings to places where the living and dead intersect. But one night, one quiet, late night, I experienced something that even now I can't explain. It was past midnight when my partner and I returned to the funeral home from a house call. We just picked up a young woman who had died of cancer. She was only 31. Something about handling someone so close to my age always struck me. It added a strange, uncomfortable intimacy to the job. My partner, David, was a deeply religious man, grounded in faith, and maybe that helped him. But that night, faith or not, something happened that neither of us would ever forget. We wheeled her body through the funeral home and into the prep room. The place was nearly silent except for the soft hum of a fan in the corner. As we moved her from the cot to the embalming table, a loud, sharp click echoed across the room. I froze. I wasn't sure where the noise came from, but before I could place it, the sound of static filled the room. Loud, abrasive static. I turned to see the source. An old, dusty radio sitting on a shelf in the corner. It was on full volume. This wasn't one of those modern radios that you could bump and accidentally turn on. No, this one had a dial that you had to physically twist until it clicked to power on. David and I looked at each other, his face as pale as the body on the table. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but the words seemed caught in his throat. I shook off the unease as best I could, swallowing the strange sense of dread that had settled over me. "It's probably just a short," I said, though even as I said it, I didn't believe it. I walked over, turned the dial back to off, and the static died. The silence rushed back, almost pressing down on us. David didn't seem convinced. He muttered something under his breath. A prayer, I think. He stayed for a few minutes more, but the incident had visibly shaken him. Eventually, he made an excuse and left for the night. Now it was just me. I'd always preferred to work alone anyway, but something about the quiet that night felt different, like the silence itself was watching me. Shaking it off, I went back to the woman on the table, set up my equipment, and got to work. Time slipped by in the usual blur of routine. I lost myself in the familiar motions, checking the tools and preparing the fluids. I'd usually have some music playing through my phone to break the silence, but that night, for some reason, I left it off. As I neared the end of the procedure, the hairs on the back of my neck prickled. It felt as if the air in the room had thickened, like it was pressing against me. I chalked it up to nerves, to the eerie radio incident, or maybe just exhaustion. I was almost done. All I had left was to move her from the embalming table to the dressing table in the adjoining room. Then it happened again. That same loud click echoed from the corner. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. My eyes went to the radio, and just like before, the static filled the room. Only this time it sounded louder, angrier somehow. The white noise blared at a volume that seemed impossible, like it was pushing itself to some limit, a wall of sound bearing down on me. My heart pounded in my chest and my hands felt cold. I hadn't touched the radio since I'd shut it off. Nobody else was there, just me and the young woman on the table. I could feel my pulse quicken as I glanced from her still face to that old radio. The two connected somehow in a way I couldn't comprehend. The room felt darker, the corners deepening into shadows. My instincts were screaming at me to leave, to get out, but I was rooted in place. My hand was frozen on the side of the table, and I swear in that moment I felt something, or someone, watching me. With shaking hands, I went over to the radio and turned the volume knob, feeling the dial under my fingertips. I shut it off, the click echoing in the room. The silence was deafening. I took a few steps back, eyes still locked on that radio, waiting, half expecting it to blare to life again. But it didn't. This time it stayed quiet. Without another glance, I wheeled the body into the dressing room. My pulse thudded in my ears as I worked quickly, keeping my back to the open doorway. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was standing just beyond my line of sight, waiting, watching. My skin prickled as I finished my work in record time. When I was done, I put everything away as fast as I could. I left the room, my footsteps echoing in the empty hall, and the silence followed me out of the funeral home. Story 2, I'd spent the better part of the evening roaming around the cemetery, just a lone patch of stones and trees in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by miles of cornfields. It's where I spent a lot of my free time, documenting headstones, taking photos, and mapping the places I'd done 100 times before in other cemeteries. It was something I enjoyed, a quiet kind of pursuit, almost meditative. But this night was different. I'd lost track of time as I worked, focusing on each engraved name and date, trying to capture everything with a clear photo, matching each stone to my notes. The sun had set almost without me noticing. The sky dimmed, and I realized belatedly that I was entirely alone in a cemetery in complete darkness. It hit me like a punch to the gut. My flashlight was low on battery. I figured I'd just grab the rest of my things, make it back to the car, and call it a night. But then I noticed something strange. There were lights, not one or two, but several, spread across the cemetery grounds. My immediate thought was lightning bugs, though they were out of season. These lights, too, were much bigger and didn't flicker or drift as fireflies would. They just floated, almost in a line, maybe 20, 30 yards apart, dotted across the headstones in an arc. I felt a tightness in my chest. My rational mind kicked in, reassuring me that it had to be some kind of natural phenomenon, maybe distant headlights reflecting off something. I was in the middle of a rural area with nothing but trees and cornfields for miles. So what could it be? I kept watching the lights, my heart starting to beat harder. Then it dawned on me. It might not be some natural phenomenon. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or worse, something, was watching me. The thought hit like a punch to the stomach. Someone was out here with me, alone, in the dark. Someone, no, multiple people, holding flashlights. The way the lights were positioned, it was like they were closing in, moving as if to flank me. I forced myself to breathe slowly, calming myself down as much as I could. It had to be nothing. I couldn't afford to panic out here, but every instinct was screaming to get out. Then something shifted, and my blood ran cold. The lights, they weren't moving like flashlights would. They didn't flick or change direction, as if being held in a steady hand. Instead, they were absolutely, eerily still, hovering right in place. A chill ran down my spine. There was no sound, nothing, just that terrible silence, like the kind right before something terrible happens. I had my flashlight, dim as it was, and I pointed it straight at one of those lights. Nothing happened. It didn't waver, didn't move, just hung there, pale and unwavering, giving off an unnatural glow. It looked close, like I could almost touch it if I walked a few paces forward. I don't know what finally pushed me into full-blown panic, but the realization hit like a hammer. I wasn't supposed to be here. Whatever those lights were, they were not meant for me to see. In that moment, I dropped everything that was weighing me down. Everything I'd brought to document the place. I could come back for it tomorrow in broad daylight. I turned and started speed walking to the car, but no matter how fast I went, the lights didn't get any further away. If anything, they seemed to be keeping pace with me, matching my speed with a terrifying steadiness. My heart was slamming in my chest. I didn't dare look over my shoulder. I didn't want to see them there, hovering behind me. The distance to my car seemed to stretch impossibly long, the path between headstones twisting and doubling back, as though the place was actively working to keep me inside. My breaths were shallow and fast, my legs shaking so badly I almost tripped more than once. I finally got to the car, fumbling with my keys in my panic. The lights were closer now, even brighter. It was as if they'd moved, deliberately, right to the edge of the lot, stopping just before reaching the gravel. I could feel my hands shaking as I shoved the key into the ignition and turned it, almost expecting it to stall. When the engine finally roared to life, I dared a glance in the rearview mirror. The lights had formed a perfect arc, lining up one by one, like they were watching me leave. I couldn't get out of there fast enough. The tires kicked up gravel, and I sped out of the cemetery, not even slowing down to see if anyone or anything followed. I didn't stop until I'd hit the main road, with the car moving and my heart finally slowing. And only then, safe under the streetlights and with some distance between me and that place, Did I let myself look back, half expecting to see those lights still floating there, just beyond the trees? But there was nothing, just darkness. Story 3. I used to work for a small, family-owned company in Virginia that specialized in setting up headstones and monuments across cemeteries in Virginia and West Virginia. We'd load up our van with carefully carved stones, tools, and supplies and travel from one cemetery to the next, often hitting multiple towns in a single day. I'd been to dozens of small towns across the region, some warm and friendly, others quiet and eerie. But there was this one town I'll never forget. The place didn't even look like it belonged in the same world. I can't explain it exactly, but the air felt heavier, and the light seemed dimmer, almost like the town was perpetually stuck under a layer of mist. It was as though someone had dialed the color saturation down, leaving everything a shade off. As I drove in, I noticed there weren't many people around. The few that were shuffled along the cracked sidewalks, staring at me with blank eyes that seemed to drill right into my soul. I tried to shake off the feeling. This was just another job, I told myself. I just needed to get it done, get out, and get back on the road. I parked near the cemetery and hauled the footstone to the designated plot. The man who'd hired us, a wiry guy named Charles, was waiting for me there. His eyes were bloodshot and his skin looked almost too tight, like it was stretched over his bones. He thanked me quietly as I set up the footstone for his brother. I remember noticing how he didn't seem all that sad, just tense, like he was waiting for something bad to happen. As I finished, Charles stepped forward, pulled a small, rough-hewn cross on a leather string from his pocket, and handed it to me. His hand trembled as he held it out, and his voice came out in a low, shaky whisper. "Take this," he said, "for protection." "Protection?" I asked, feeling a chill slide down my spine. He just nodded, his eyes darting toward the cemetery's edge, where twisted, blackened trees lined the grounds. "You might need it," he added, barely above a whisper. I wasn't one to refuse a gift, so I took it, slipping it into my pocket. Charles nodded stiffly, then turned and walked off without another word, disappearing down one of the narrow, empty streets. I didn't stick around much longer. The whole place was creeping me out, so I packed up, hopped in the van, and headed back to my hotel, eager to get as far from that town as possible. That night, as I sat on the bed, I remembered the cross in my pocket. Pulling it out, I examined it more closely. It was just a simple wooden cross, small and crude, carved from some dark wood. The leather string looked old, like it had been through some things. As I turned it over in my hands, I noticed a faint, sticky residue on the surface. It was reddish-brown, dried up in little patches along the wood. I thought it might just be some varnish or tree sap, but something about it didn't sit right. I brushed it off, set it on the nightstand, and tried to forget about it. That's when things started getting weird. Around midnight, I woke up feeling off. The room was dark, pitch black, and an unnatural silence hung in the air, like everything around me had stopped. I felt a prickling on the back of my neck, that eerie sensation that someone was watching me. I tried to shake it off, but the feeling just wouldn't go away. And then I noticed the cross. It was glowing, not a soft, warm glow. This was a deep, pulsing red, almost like it was alive. The sight of it sent a cold wave of fear through me, but I couldn't look away. I felt rooted to the spot, my eyes locked on that glowing red cross, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The red intensified, turning the whole room into a hellish shade of crimson. I thought I heard a low whisper, just on the edge of my hearing, but the words were garbled, twisted. I couldn't make sense of it, but whatever it was didn't sound human. It felt like something was trying to get inside my head, and it was growing louder, angrier. I could barely breathe, and a crushing fear clawed at my chest. Then as suddenly as it had started, the light vanished. The cross lay there on the nightstand, looking as innocent as it had when Charles handed it to me. But I knew what I'd seen. The silence returned, even heavier than before, pressing down on me. I felt like something was lurking, waiting, just beyond the edges of the light. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I kept the lights on, sitting there in the eerie glow, watching the cross with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Every slight creak, Every flicker of the shadows sent jolts of terror through me. It felt like time had stopped, stretching out in a nightmare that refused to end. By the time dawn broke, I was a wreck. I stuffed the cross back in my pocket, threw my things together, and checked out without a backward glance. I wanted nothing more than to leave that cursed town and that cross far behind me. I thought about tossing it out the window as I drove, but something held me back. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was fear. Either way, I couldn't bring myself to let it go. After that night, I kept it in a box, hidden away in a drawer, refusing to look at it again. I never mentioned it to anyone, but sometimes late at night, I swear I feel that same unnatural silence creeping in around me, that prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I know it sounds crazy, but I can't shake the feeling that something stayed with me that night, something I can't quite explain. And that cross, it's still in my drawer, buried under odds and ends, out of sight but never out of mind. Every now and then, I think about getting rid of it, but a part of me knows, whatever it is, whatever came with it, it's not something I can just throw away. Story 4. That night still haunts me. I used to work at a graveyard down in Florida. Not a long time, just a couple months, but enough to know that place. Old oaks hung low, shading weathered stones, and everything felt heavy, like the air itself had absorbed the grief from decades past. It was a quiet spot, out of the way, peaceful mostly. Most days I'd handle the odd maintenance task, mow the grass, trim the bushes, keep things respectable. But that afternoon, something happened that I still don't have an answer for. It wasn't my shift, just a lunch break, but I don't think I'll ever forget it. They were digging a fresh grave on the south side that morning, about 20 feet from the fence, near the old soldiers' memorial. It was one of those long, sunken spots that looks like it's been waiting forever to swallow something up. The guys on the crew had left the excavator there, half finished, because they'd gone home early. "Rain's coming," they'd said, though the sky was clear as day. I figured they'd just gotten spooked. It wasn't the first time someone said they felt something strange around that part of the yard. So around noon, I sat down for my break, just around the corner from the big yellow machine. I'd seen that thing in action 100 times, its teeth scraping at the earth. But that day, with nobody around, it was like it was just waiting. I'd barely unwrapped my sandwich when I heard it. A low, rhythmic bang. At first, I thought it was a truck rumbling down the road, maybe hitting a pothole. But it didn't fade. Instead, it grew louder, like someone hammering hard metal against metal. Bang, bang, bang. I was so sure someone was working on the excavator that I almost ignored it. But as I sat there, the sound felt off. It wasn't just noise. It was insistent. Like something was trying to get my attention. 3 minutes passed, then 5. I kept glancing over at the machine, half expecting to see one of the guys bent over, tools in hand, but no one was there. The graveyard was dead silent. No wind, no birds, just that endless, steady clang. It seemed to echo off the stones, bouncing from one grave to the next, so that it was impossible to tell exactly where it came from. He wheeled the gurney into the room where the cremation chamber stood, the hum of the machinery echoing in the silence. It was routine, he told me. He'd done it hundreds of times. Slide the body in, close the door, press a button. But that night, just as he began to guide the body into the oven, something shifted. At first, he thought it was his mind playing tricks on him, but then it happened again. He was holding the gurney handle, and he felt it, something pushing back. Then with a slow, sickening realization, he saw the sheet begin to rise, ever so slightly, like the chest beneath it was breathing. But it couldn't be. The man was dead, he told himself, already confirmed by the hospital and checked by Dad himself before he even brought the body in. But as he watched, the body sat up. For a split second, he thought maybe he was hallucinating. The figure under the sheet lurched forward like it was trying to rise completely. He froze, caught between disbelief and terror, feeling the blood drain from his face. He told me he almost ran. He said he could barely think straight, could barely breathe, but he was rooted in place, unable to make his legs work. Then just as he finally summoned the will to back away, it happened. The figure under the sheet screamed. Dad's voice shook as he described it, and for the first time, I saw tears welling in his eyes. He said it wasn't a natural scream, like a person in pain or shock. It was something else. It was loud and raw, filled with a primal agony that he couldn't describe. The sound pierced through the room, filling every corner, every crevice. He swore he could feel it in his bones. He stumbled back, instinctively reaching for the door, ready to bolt out of that room. But something inside him, maybe his training or just plain denial, forced him to stay. The scream finally died down, echoing off the metal walls, leaving an unnatural silence in its wake. The body collapsed back onto the gurney, the sheets settling as if nothing had happened. Dad said he stared at it, his mind racing, unable to comprehend what he'd just seen. He had dealt with bodies in various states, seen the ways they could twitch or shift from trapped air or rigor mortis. But this was different. There was no scientific explanation he could find in that moment, just pure, raw fear. He was in shock, he told me, unable to process what had happened. But he forced himself to finish the job. It was as though his hands were moving on their own, driven by some desperate need to complete the ritual, to end whatever unnatural horror he had just witnessed. He reached out, trembling, and finally pushed the body into the chamber. He said he closed the door and hit the ignition, never looking back, his fingers numb as he watched the flames ignite, heard the crackling sound from within. Only then did he allow himself to breathe again, feeling the weight of whatever had just occurred begin to lift slightly. But that wasn't the end. He told me that later, after the body was nothing but ashes. He sat there, just staring at the remains, wondering if any trace of whatever horror he'd witnessed was still there, hiding beneath the dust. I remember the silence that followed after he finished telling me his story. The air felt colder somehow, and all I could hear was the hum of the cremation machine, like a distant echo of the scream he'd described. Dad looked down at his hands that had been steady and strong his whole life, now trembling in the dim light. We sat in silence, just him and me, and in that moment I could feel the weight of his fear, the lingering dread that had followed him ever since that night. Neither of us said a word, and for the first time, I wished I'd never asked. There was something in the air, something unspoken that I felt in my bones. Whatever had happened in that room was beyond explanation, beyond any comfort that logic or reason could offer.